Puberty in girls starts with the hypothalamus releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. This goes to the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. FSH then is carried by the blood to the ovary, where follicle development is stimulated. The follicles within the ovary secrete estrogen, which stimulates the development of secondary female characteristics, breasts, hair, and wider hips. Female reproductive goals include developing a follicle, which makes an egg, develop the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, ovulate, fertilize an implant, and maintain the corpus luteum and endometrium, or shed to reset for the next month. This is all accomplished via hormonal control. This is a cross-section of an ovary. The menstrual cycle lasts about 28 days. We can see the smallest cells here, those are follicles, and they're immature. They have not undergone meiosis or finished meiosis yet, so they are still 2N. The follicles later on, the cell inside them has divided once, meiosis 1, to become 1N. So we're talking about the egg or ovum. It's released on about day 14, and that is called ovulation. From the ovary, it travels to the fallopian tube, where meiosis 2 occurs if it is fertilized. After that, the follicle cells become a corpus luteum, and it is maintained for the rest of the month. Okay, so let's start at the beginning of the menstrual cycle. FSH starts stimulating the follicles day 1 of the menstrual cycle. The follicles then, as they mature, release estrogen. Estrogen causes the release of LH, which peaks on day 14 to cause ovulation and to cause the follicle to turn into a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then secretes progesterone and estrogen for the rest of the cycle, so days 15 to 28. The order of the hormones every month, the order in which they peak is FSH, then estrogen, LH, progesterone, and then lower amount of estrogen, so felpe, however you want to pronounce it. Okay, this is a cross-section of an ovary, and in here we really just are looking at the number 6, mature follicles. So here is a mature follicle, and in that follicle we can see an ovum developing. Let's draw the feedback loop for the female hormones. Hypothalamus releases GnRH, which goes to the anterior pituitary to release FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which goes to the ovary, specifically the follicle. The follicle then secretes estrogen. The anterior pituitary releases LH, which stimulates the corpus luteum to secrete progesterone and estrogen. Now, estrogen is released during the first half of the menstrual cycle, and it then causes LH to peak and turns down FSH. Then, second half of the cycle coming down, LH stimulates the corpus luteum to secrete estrogen and progesterone, and that's the second half of the menstrual cycle. When progesterone and estrogen levels are high, FSH and LH levels are low, which means that's why birth control pills work, because they're high in progesterone and estrogen. So as long as they are high, there is no FSH, which means no development of an egg, and no LH, so no ovulation. The term menstrual cycle typically refers to the events that occur during an ovarian cycle, so those in the ovary, and the uterine cycle. So here's the ovarian cycle. So we're talking the follicle and the corpus luteum, so the follicular phase and luteal phase. And then the uterine cycle, we're talking about events that happen in the uterus. So development and release of the endometrium. The menstrual cycle lasts about 28 days. Let's just label on the diagram. Here's the ovarian cycle, so the various follicle and then corpus luteum. And the uterine cycle shows the layer, the blood layer, the endometrium. So the first part of the menstrual cycle is the flow phase, days 1 to 5, during which the endometrium is shed. That's what we're seeing here. And we start the follicle to grow in the ovary. Estrogen and progesterone levels are low. Okay, so that's the flow phase, and that's, of course, stimulated, or the follicle is stimulated by FSH. Next, we have the follicular phase, where the follicles are growing, they're mature, they're secreting estrogen. Estrogen causes the endometrium to thicken, and it stimulates GnRH and LH. So that is the follicular phase. On day 14 is ovulation. This is caused by LH. It causes the ovum, so here's LH peaking, causes the ovum to burst from the follicle in the ovary and into the oviduct or fallopian tube. Immediately following that is the luteal phase, named for the corpus luteum. LH causes the corpus luteum to develop from the follicle. The corpus luteum then secretes estrogen and progesterone. Both of them cause the endometrium to thicken, and it's maintained, which means progesterone prevents contractions. And notice how high estrogen and progesterone and how big the endometrium is. When progesterone and estrogen are high, they inhibit GnRH, LH, and FSH. Oops, and that's the luteal phase. Okay, let's look at the levels of hormones. So hormones in this order: FLP, FSH is the first hormone, so let's number that on the graph and then trace it. It's highest in the beginning, smaller peak right before day 14, and then lowers. Second hormone is estrogen. It has two kind of rolling peaks just before ovulation to cause the release of LH, and it starts to increase again in case there's a fertilized egg to cause growth of the endometrium. Third hormone is LH. I think it's the most easily recognizable because it peaks on day 14. And then progesterone. It's the last to peak, and it's in the second half of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so let's review the hormones. FSH targets the follicles in the ovary. Okay, so here we see FSH coming from the anterior pituitary, stimulates the follicles, and it causes them to grow an egg and to release estrogen. Estrogen targets various cells, including the endometrium and hypothalamus. Its effect includes development of the secondary sexual characteristics, so breasts and larger hips, negative feedback to decrease FSH, positive feedback to increase LH, and growth of the endometrium. So in this picture, we're going to label negative for FSH and positive for LH. Progesterone is negative for both FSH and LH. LH targets the follicle for ovulation and the corpus luteum. Effect: it causes ovulation and progesterone and estrogen production. Progesterone targets the endometrium and the hypothalamus. Its effect is it thickens and maintains the endometrium because it inhibits contractions. So as long as there's no contractions in the uterus, the endometrium stays. And negative feedback to lower GnRH, FSH, and LH. Okay, let's label the ovary. Let's start with all of these cells. We can tell these are before ovulation, so they are all follicles. The smallest ones are still 2N. They have not undergone meiosis 1. The rest of the follicles are 1N. The act of the egg leaving the ovary is ovulation. The other name for egg is ovum. And then after ovulation, all of the cells are the corpus luteum. Let's talk about the hormones. First hormone every month is FSH. It causes the follicles to release estrogen, which then causes the release of LH, which finally causes the release of progesterone and estrogen. If pregnancy does not occur, Then estrogen and progesterone levels drop. This is at the end of the month. The endometrium lining is shed and bleeding occurs. So it's menstruation. What would happen if a pregnancy occurred around day 21? And we say day 21 because although the egg is released on day 14 and fertilized within 24 hours, otherwise it dies, it takes about 5, 6, or 7 days to travel to the uterus and implant in the endometrium. Okay, so let's look at FSH and LH. They are needed to make an egg and ovulate. That's not needed during pregnancy, so they are low. Next, the corpus luteum is quite large for the first 3 months because it's stimulated by a hormone produced by the growing blastocyst. Next, we have estrogen and progesterone, which are needed in high amounts during pregnancy because they both cause growth of the endometrium, which is the mum side of the placenta, and progesterone prevents contractions. Last, during pregnancy, if we could draw this graph bigger, we would, the endometrium grows considerably because it forms part of the placenta. Menopause occurs around age 50. The ova, which is plural for ovum, are no longer produced. Estrogen decreases by 35% and progesterone decreases by 75%. Symptoms include hot flashes, high cholesterol, and decreasing bone mass. A woman could have hormone replacement therapy in which they're given low doses of estrogen and some progesterone. So there's 2 types of meiosis. In males, it is spermatogenesis. In females, it is oogenesis. It is located in the testes in males and in the ovaries and fallopian tube in females. Remember, meiosis 1 occurs in the ovaries and meiosis 2 only if fertilized. So we start out with a 2N follicle, which divides during meiosis 1 to produce 2 smaller 1N cells, and then finally 4 sperm. In females, it's similar, but a little different. One cell gets most of the cytoplasm. That cell will become the egg. And then during meiosis 2, they split once more, and in the end, we get 1 egg and 3 polar bodies. So these cells just die. The egg will also die within 24 hours if it is not fertilized. The egg or ovum gets most of the cytoplasm. The polar bodies die and are absorbed by the body. Okay, so 150 to 300 million sperm travel through the cervix to the uterus. 100 to about 500 sperm reach the oviducts. How do they get there? The egg may send out chemicals that tell the sperm which oviduct it is in. The egg has lots of cytoplasm, and sperm have very little cytoplasm, which makes them more aerodynamic. The cytoplasm of the egg has to nourish the zygote for approximately 5 days, because that's how long it takes to travel down the fallopian tube to reach the uterus. So why don't more than one sperm fertilize the egg? The egg has a thick layer of cells and jelly protecting it. It takes hundreds of sperm to break through that shield. If that happens, one sperm may fertilize the egg. But 40,000 sperm fit into an egg cell. So when the sperm fertilizes the egg then releases a chemical, a protective barrier, so no other sperm can get in. Okay, so here we have the fallopian tube. Here's an egg, and here is the sperm. Here they are uniting, and the nucleus enters. So that is fertilization. So now we have the sperm nucleus inside of the egg. Then the egg undergoes meiosis 2. Remember, the sperm has 23 chromosomes, so it's 1N. Same with the egg. When they join their nuclei, then it is a zygote, which is 2N.